Men, when people are thinking about teaching Bible studies, it's not a matter of just going to just teach the Bible study. There's a philosophy that comes in, and both of you have different approaches on how you go about determining how to approach these people at this time. Brother Cornwell, talk to us kind of about your philosophy of teaching Bible studies.
First of all, I teach systematic and chronological Bible study. I believe that the Bible was laid out many years ago for us, and if the Bible is laid out correctly, God started in Genesis 1:1. And so that lets me know that I should not start at Acts 2:38. Start where God started, work the way God worked through the Bible, systematically and chronologically. And I believe the Bible is laid out in such a way as to help men get a progressive revelation of God. That being said, my philosophy when I go into a Bible study, I use what I call the Exodus principle. And that is when the children of Israel were in bondage in Egypt, God had to bring them from the bondage of Egypt into the promised land. And the book of Exodus is laid out in such a way that it's divided up into three parts. There may be 1,000 sermons in the book of Exodus, but basically there's three major divisions of the book of Exodus, of God bringing them from Egypt to the promised land. The first division of the book of Exodus is found in the first 19 chapters, which is almost half the book of Exodus. And that is the deliverance from Egypt all the way to the Red Sea. And God brought them out of Egypt, but he didn't just bring them out of Egypt. He also established them in the next 5 chapters. He gave them the 10 Commandments, the law of the Lord. And then the third division is chapter 25, where he gave them the tabernacle, to chapter 40. So I break it down like this. He had to deliver them, he had to disciple them, and he had to teach them church life. So when I go into a Bible study, I'm not trying to get them saved in one Bible study. I'm going to spend most of my time getting them exposed to their bondage and delivering them from their own bondage through the Word. And then as they are delivered from whatever is holding them back, I start discipling them. I start teaching them the law of the Lord. And as the law of the Lord becomes a part of their life, then I start teaching them church life. So you got deliverance, you got discipleship, you got church life. I'm not interested in just teaching them a Bible study. I want them to go from Egypt to the promised land, from being a sinner to being a child of God sitting on a church pew. And so I use that approach in every Bible study. I've been teaching Bible studies for 45 plus years. And I still do it exactly the same way today as I did 45 years ago. And this approach of deliverance.
Right. I've heard you talk on the subject of deliverance. When you go into a Bible study, you've talked about how everyone has bondage. Somebody is always bound by something.
Yes.
And you're trying to zero in on the individually.
Individual. I always start with one couple. I never start with a group, because you got to zero in on that family. Everybody that you teach has sin in their life. Mm-hmm. I refer that to bondage. There are some bondages that people have that are not readily visible. And we got to understand that there's more bondages besides alcohol, drugs, and tobacco.
Right.
And so if I knew what their bondage was, I could zero in on it. But many times that would just be guessing what their bondage is when that person is an individual. So as I start teaching the book of Genesis, the creation, the fall of man, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, the Tower of Babel, the call of Abraham, the mistakes of Abraham, Jacob, all of his problems, Joseph. Each one of these stories attacks some kind of bondage in a person's life. And as I'm teaching them, I watch them, I observe them, and you can tell when a portion of the word starts affecting them. And then somewhere during that time of deliverance, I am literally bringing them to a decision. And you cannot win people without causing them to come to a decision. And when they come to that decision, they got to make the right decision to release their bondage or their sin, or they're going to say, I'm going to hold on to my bondage. And at that point, that's the crisis point. You're bringing them to a crisis. And if they make the right decision, their attitude towards Bible study, towards Christ, towards the church is going to change. If they decide to hang on to their bondage, they may want you to continue Bible study, but they're never going to make a commitment. You can teach them a year, and they're not going to change. So that's where if they make the wrong decision, I finish the Bible study, thank them for taking Bible study, then I go find another couple.
I see. And so that encapsulates the philosophy whenever you're starting a Bible study.
Yes.
And then taking it individually and then processing them through.
Yeah. And it's very important that as you teach these stories in the book of Genesis and the Bible, that you're putting word into them so that when they come to that crisis, they have something within them from the word that will help them expel their bondage.
Right. Very good. Very good. Brother Johnson, when you're thinking philosophy, how do you go about it?
Well, I've taught Bible studies for 52 years. And from the inception of my teaching, I discovered that to take a person who knew little or nothing about the Bible, little or nothing about church history, little or nothing about our doctrines, there had to be a process of teaching to bring them to accept this and understand that. Also, I discovered very early that without a proper knowledge of the Bible, it's almost impossible for a person to serve God as the Bible requires us. You've got to have that knowledge. So I developed a system of teaching and reaching new people. Now, in my philosophy of teaching Bible study, I understand that when I meet this person, I want to understand how he or she thinks. So in Bible study, I have time from first lesson to the close of the Old Testament. I have time to make friends with them. I have time to understand them. I have time to understand why they have the questions they have, where they acquired these questions from their religious backgrounds. I have time to make friends with them and let them trust me in knowing that when I answer their question in Bible study, it's going to be done scripturally accurate. It's going to be done unbiased. It's going to be done historically accurate. So I can bring them first to a friendship with me and them. And then at that point, when they come to the New Testament, I know what their fears are of doctrines. Now, right now, in pseudo-Christianity, they use fear stimuli to fight against us in our apostolic doctrines. The pseudo-Christian world can't defeat us with Bible or with facts of history. Those facts are in our favor. So they create a fear in these people. Those fears must be relieved. We must be delivered from. So in this teaching process, I can achieve that. And then, of course, in the teaching process in the Old Testament, I can bring them to a trust in me and trust in my church and our doctrines. That we come to the New Testament, I know what their questions are going to be. Now, in doing that, I will make a promise with them from lesson 1. I will speak as the Bible speaks. I will be silent when the Bible is silent. There are so many areas when people speaks, but the Bible's not saying that. 10,000 times I've been asked, who is the Antichrist? The Bible doesn't say. So I must be silent there. So I speak what the Bible speaks, and then I am silent when the Bible is silent. Secondly, if I can't answer that question then, I ask for the pleasure of having the next week to study their question, bring back research answers for them to answer that question. And so then history, I tell them we will speak where history speaks, and where history is silent, then we must be silent. But when we get to that facet, I remind them that, remember, in history, there are some bloody pages. I didn't write history. They didn't write history. They're not responsible for what their forefathers may have done. I'm not responsible for what my forefathers have done. I'm only responsible for my own answers to the Bible. As I understand the Bible, I must answer to God for myself and work to achieve that. So that's my general philosophy of Bible studies.
We were visiting at one point, and well, you've said so many interesting things, but you were talking about the individual and taking in their background, their education, their religion. How when you're dealing with somebody, what are the questions that you're stepping through that you need to have a good understanding of these different areas of their life?
Okay, I learned very early in my teaching experience that these three areas are all important for consideration for myself and for my teachers I am training. So I've practiced, first of all, I want to have a conversation with this person before I begin my Bible lesson and try to ascertain their educational levels. Also, I want to know their religious background. Also, I want to know their temperament. All right, let's go back to the educational levels. I've taught judges. I won a judge. I've taught, in fact, I'm teaching a lawyer now on Tuesday night. I've taught lawyers and won them. I've taught other highly educated people and won them. Now, those type people, if you go in talking country Duncan talk, you bore them. So you must bring educational levels and your answers up to that level. On the contrary, if you're teaching a person that's poorly educated, I've taught them. I've taught people who couldn't read or write. I could bring my teachings down to that level and be sure they understood what I was saying. So to understand their educational background is very important. Now, their religious background. Each denomination has its circle of answers and defense. Once you learn that circle that they're talking in, then you understand how to answer their questions. Okay? So the religious background is important. Now, there again, this is in my favor, because when I get into the history of pseudo-Christianity, and they really learn by fact when the denomination started, didn't start in the Bible. And let me say, no denomination starts in the Bible. Every denomination is man-made. There's a time when that denomination did not exist, there's a time when that denomination began. From the time it didn't exist back, you have a pattern there. You have a template in the book of Acts. The book of Acts is the template for all churches of all times until the end of this dispensation. That's set. So when they learn when the denomination started, long after the Bible closed, long after AD 96 when the last apostle died, and on that line of the origin of pseudo-Christianity and its daughters, they learn where their church started and who founded that church. Then they begin to question, was that right? Who gave them the authority to start a denomination whose teachings is exactly opposite of that template we have in Scripture? That's important. So I can use that. Now, the temperament. Some people are so timid, you got to ask the questions for them and answer them for them. Others, if you give them one chance, they take over, they teach, and you listen. So in my philosophy there, and my evaluation of them, watch that, and that's important for myself. And when I'm teaching and training my teachers, I always make them follow that same pattern to protect them, because I do not want my teachers bruised or stumped by some question that embarrasses them, that they'll be embarrassed to go back and teach these people. So by upfront being honest with them and have this approach, I can protect myself and also the teachers I'm training. I teach them how to protect themselves in that situation.
Very good, very good. You also mentioned one time the different levels of questions that when you go into a Bible study, you can tell when you're answering their questions, and then it's like a progression until you get to where you know you're answering the level of questions that you know you're at the point where it's going to turn. Explain what you're listening for.
That's very important there, because once a person, as Brother Cornwell mentioned, becomes interested in the study and starts studying with us, probably their church attendance to their denominations are going to sort of decline. Their pastors are going to know why. All right, one or two things. These people that we're teaching, we start asking their pastor, what about this here? What about this thing I'm hearing that this other preacher is teaching about? What about that? The pastor himself won't come sit in the class, which I would welcome if he would come. I'd be glad to have him sit in my class. He won't do that. They'll form questions to this parishioner of theirs to ask us in the class. Knowing their educational level, knowing their religious background, I can tell automatically and very quickly if that's the question coming from this parishioner, or that's a question being formed by their pastor and sent to me to answer, hoping he will confuse me. So that's what I meant by that. Now, when that happens, then I can answer that question. I know it's taking place here, so I'll form a question for them to go back and ask their pastor. When he starts evading those questions and telling that parishioner, that ex-parishioner, I have an appointment, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you about this, et cetera, then that parishioner sees this man's not capable of dealing with us. That helps us to win the confidence and also the situation to our advantage.
All right. Philosophy. Brother Cornwell?
One of the things that I've noticed that Brother Johnson and I both totally agree on, in the Old Testament, we build close relationships to the people we're teaching. While you're teaching, while you're bringing them to conviction, all these things, we are not only teaching them the Bible, but we're building relationships with them, and we are ministering to them. You get somebody to sit down with you, it's not about just the cold letter of the law of teaching, but it's ministering to them. It's building relationships with them. For instance, I'm teaching a Bible study now that they have 3 small children and a young couple. You can imagine the stress that families are now to have 3 children in diapers at one time. The mother's stressed out. Dad has his problems. But when you sit down and you accept their children just like you accept them, like this Bible study, I got one of the children that's on the back of my chair hanging on my head. I got another in this arm. I got another in this arm. Usually I try to teach the Bible from my iPad. They're constantly changing pages on me. If I'm using my Bible, I wear out a Bible a year because they're going to tear my Bible up. And building that relationship, I think Brother Johnson will agree, is so important. If they think you're there just to convert them,
Right.
you're not going to convert them.
Right.
But if you're there to minister to them, to help them in their everyday life, you can win them to God.